At the easternmost point along the Connecticut shoreline lies the town of Stonington. Rich in history and cultural diversity since European settlers arrived in 1634. The area adjacent to a well-sheltered harbor was densely settled in the early 19th century by people with seafaring interests. When work on the rail lines between Boston and New York was delayed in the 1830s, that part of Stonington was the perfect location for a terminus. Raw materials and manufactured goods from New England could be loaded onto steamers for an overnight journey to New York. That brought industry, prosperity, and population. That part of the greater town of Stonington became a unique political entity, a borough, which provided more urban services such as fire protection, road pavement and illumination, parks, and even trash pickup for its own tax rate. Still a borough today, the village has a deep sense of history and community. St. Mary Church has contributed to that community for the past 150 years. The nucleus of the Catholic community in Stonington began with the rail workers and some of their families. Their numbers were swelled in the mid-1840s by their countrymen from the west of Ireland fleeing famine. Their lives were centered on faith. Records at the Evergreen Cemetery, just outside the borough, indicate that Mr. John Kirby, a Catholic and native of Ireland, was buried there in 1840.
He seems to have been kind of, I think we might say, the ringleader of the Catholics to, and perhaps his brother encouraged him to do this, to get a priest to come here from time to time and offer Mass for the people.
Mr. Kirby operated a school at his house on North Water Street. Most likely, the first Mass in Stonington was offered there, perhaps by his brother, who had been rector of the Irish College in Rome.
There are people from the western part of Ireland. They're from Galway and Mayo and Connemara, that part of Ireland. And in other words, they're the victims of the potato famine in the 1840s. And they came here primarily to get away from that, to get away from political and religious persecution, and because they could find work here, and the work they found was building railroads.
Those days worked on the railroad because this was a railroad center. I remember Mr. Coffey and Pat Coffey that lived down in the borough, and the other uncle I had. They were all, Mr. Ledwith, they were all connected with the railroad.
By 1840, Father James Fitton was coming regularly to Stonington. House masses were nothing new to the Irish immigrants whose churches at home had been confiscated for non-Catholic worship.
At the end of the potato famine in the 1840s, there were enough Catholic people here that there were enough so that a priest was sent here when he could come to say Mass for them. And because these people came from that part of Ireland, the English had closed all the Catholic churches down there and had taken them over. And because of when that happened, the Irish people simply had the priest come to their house for Mass for what they called the stations. They'd say, well, where's the station this week? And that's where Mass would be.
The designated house for Mass was called the station. In Stonington, too, the community met for Mass in the McCarthy, Sullivan, Carr, and Gilmore homes. In 1847, Bishop Tyler of Hartford negotiated the purchase of land at the north end of the borough from William Comstock. Financial constraints and Bishop Tyler's ill health and death in 1849 kept him from establishing a parish here.
The property here was purchased around 1846 or 1847 by the bishop, by the diocese, with the intention of starting a parish. And then the bishop got sick and it never came through, and then he died. But one of the first acts of the new bishop was to send a priest and start a parish here.
In November of 1850, Bishop Bernard O'Reilly took on responsibilities for the diocese, which comprised Connecticut and Rhode Island. In December of 1850, he appointed Father Patrick Duffy pastor of the Catholic community in Stonington, thereby making it a parish under the special patronage of the Blessed Virgin Mary. In the spring of 1851, work commenced on the original church building. The project was done under the supervision of Frank Sylvia, or Francisco de Silva, a local builder and member of the community.
He built a number of buildings here in the borough, including the church, and so that was actually, the church was actually built by a member of the parish. And I'm assuming, because this is the way things were done in those days, that he was kind of a foreman, and that he had other parishioners as volunteers working on building the building, because that's normally what they did with churches at that period of time.
The church was dedicated on October 5th, 1851. The parish at that time included Catholics from Thames River in the west to Narragansett, Rhode Island in the east. Mr. Sylvia's contribution reminds us that Stonington's Catholic population always included Portuguese immigrants and seafaring visitors from the mid-Atlantic Azores Islands. They were included in Catholic activities from the start. The first child of Portuguese parents to be entered into the baptismal register of the new parish of St. Mary was Antonia Maria de Mello on August 17, 1851.
From Cannon Square down, it was mostly Portuguese and mostly fishermen. We were poor. We didn't know that we were poor or think we were poor because everybody was on the same level. And people had a hard time, but as far as money is concerned. But it was a very happy time at the same time because people were, the Portuguese are very religious, and no matter what happened, it was the God's will, and it will be better, it will get better. And so they had that faith that kept them going.
By the early 1900s, Azorean immigrants inhabited the borough in such numbers that they were able to organize the Portuguese Holy Ghost Society. This group was initiated for the purpose of hosting a yearly Holy Ghost feast, which is an event that is celebrated in the borough to this day.
The Holy Ghost ceremony is actually an Azorean feast. It's not a Portuguese feast. We had a priest from Portugal whose brother lived in Stonington who used to come to visit his brother before the brother passed away. And he was quite fascinated by the Holy Ghost feast because he had never heard of any such thing. And he really enjoyed it and liked coming to see it and be part of it because it was something that he was just not familiar with from Portugal at all.
King Dennis ruled Portugal. The queen was Queen Isabel, and she was very fond of the poor. She liked to, she took bread and food to the poor when they were hungry. And they had the rainy season one time, and they thought they would have a famine because the rain was ruining the crops. And so she prayed to the Lord to stop the rain so that the crops would not be ruined. And she said that if that had happened, if the Lord had favored her with that petition, that she would sell her jewels and feed the poor. And after a few days, the rain stopped. And so when all this was settled, she sold her jewels and had a big festivity where there was a big a procession and, of course, mass and a big religious service. And then everybody was welcome to the festivity. And the food, they arranged all the food, and there was plenty of food for everybody to get their fill. And and because of that, the people who have come over to this country have continued that festivity here in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And the crown, they have a symbol as a crown, which represents her crown. And the Holy Spirit is the dove on the scepter that goes in the crown. And then 7 weeks before the festivity, the crown is moved from house to house. Whoever wins the dominga, as they called it, that crown goes from house to house. for 7 Sundays, and then they have the big festivity, and they have a big meal who is free for everybody in town, anybody that wants to come, and they're free to eat, and there's always plenty of food for everybody, and so that they carry on that festivity still, yeah.
The growing granite industry and booming mills along the Pawcatuck River, separating Stonington from westerly Rhode Island, 5 miles east of the borough, led Father Michael O'Reilly to transfer his activities to a large tract of land available to him on the Connecticut side of the river. In 1861, the parish of St. Michael the Archangel was established in the section of town called Pawcatuck. St. Mary Church became a mission, where Mass was offered weekly by priests from St. Michael. When the parish of St. Patrick was founded in Stonington's westernmost village, Mystic, in the 1880s, Father Doherty, its first pastor, took responsibility for St. Mary as well. During the mission period, activities continued for St. Mary's community. In 1882, Frank Sylvia purchased 5 acres along the Mystic Road, now Route 1, to donate to St. Mary's for a cemetery. Father J.B. Doherty dedicated the cemetery on July 23, 1882.
Mr. Sylvia, who had already built the church and who has a large tomb in the cemetery, was the one who donated the property opposite his own property where his house is at Vargas Corner, named for his son-in-law.
The Nina Council, number 43, of the Knights of Columbus was established during the mission period. On October 22, 1894, St. Mary's was partially damaged by fire. Father Doherty led the St. Mary community to accept the tragedy as an opportunity to renovate the church. The generous response of St. Mary parishioners to the needs of their church has remained a true hallmark of the community. In 1901, Bishop Tierney appointed Father John C. Lynch pastor of St. Mary's. It was a parish once again. The St. Francis Ladies' Aid Society was set up with Anne McGrath as president. William Noonan became president of a Young Men's Catholic Club. Charity balls and other activities could be accommodated at the house at 170 Water Street, purchased by Father Lynch from Mrs. Emma Smith for use as a rectory and parish hall. Between 1914 and 1926, Father R. O'Brien served as St. Mary's pastor. He was known for his no-nonsense approach to getting things done at the church, and for his closeness to many parish families.
He was part of the village of Stonington. Everybody, even if it were non-Catholic, you know, he made sick calls. They were friends.
He used to let the Daughters of Isabella go in and have bingo games. And then, as I said, the picnics over at Wheeler's Grove. And he did a lot of things for the children.
And he had his little, I don't know, like a little touring car. Yeah. But every time he wanted something done, he'd come and pick the boys up. And so I knew Father, and I felt very free to talk to him. And I remember one day he came to the door, he rang the doorbell, and I went to the door, and he said, "I'm looking for your brother. Is Petey around?" And I looked him right in the eye, and I said, "No." And then he said to me, "Do you know what happens to little girls when they die and they tell lies?" And I said, "Yes, they go to hell." He said, "Well, then I'll give you another chance. Is your brother Petey around?" He said, "'Cause I saw him a minute ago in the backyard." And I said, "Yes, he is." He said, "Well, why did you tell me he wasn't home?" I said, "Because you're always coming in and picking him up and taking him for a ride in the car, and you've never taken me for one." So he said, "Go tell your mother you're going for a ride with me." So I went around the neighborhood and back, and I was happy. Father O'Brien gave very definite sermons. I mean, and if something bothered him, I know sometimes some of the kids would come in late and he'd say, "You're coming in here like a truckload of Joe Vargas's horses. Wait till I get through talking and then come if you're late."
Father Edmund Cotter purchased the present rectory and magnificent property at 95 Main Street in 1927. he took up residence there, leaving the Water Street Hall for parish activities. In 1935, Father Patrick Mahoney became pastor. He started to generate new interest and activities. The hall was filled with events for children and youth.
Father Mahoney, I guess it was, bought that house across the way over here for the church, for the Boy Scouts. I was in the Boy Scouts. We had two troops in town, Troop 16 from the church and Troop 18, we call it the Protestant bunch.
Summer bazaars on the rectory property became a feature that would endure until the mid-1980s.
There were a few people who used to run it, and they worked awful hard putting that together. And they had a lot of booths, the spin the wheel type of booths, throw the ball type of booths, rings, ring throwing. And then it'd have that that moon machine for the kids that inflated by air. And then of course they have the bake table and horseshoes. I can remember they used to play horseshoes.
Linguiça and peppers.
Oh yes, linguiça and peppers. Have to have a lot of that. It was well attended, and it was a great fundraiser.
The annual parish spring minstrel shows, first at the town hall and later at the new St. Mary's, began during Father Mahoney's time.
We were getting 16 and 17. We were going out square dancing Saturday nights and not getting in any trouble, but we were having a good time. So my mother went to the priest one time. She says, Father, I'd like to have you talk to Albert sometime. So after Mass one time, he called me. He says, Albert, he says, Saturday night, he says, I'll never forget it. He says, Saturday night's the devil's night, he says. Meaning to take it easy, so.
September 21st, 1938 is a defining date in borough and parish history. A devastating hurricane and tidal wave hit the southeastern New England coast.
The water seemed to go out of the harbor, and it was like one big mud flat, and then it looked like a huge whale coming in. It rolled in, and that's what did a lot of damage.
The water went right up over the railroad tracks, and everything was covered with a sea. And Miller's Foundry, which was across the street, was flat on the ground. And we had a little separate building for the first grade at that time. That was in the middle of the boys' playground. It was just pushed right off its position.
In addition to much displacement and damage, there were 4 deaths in the borough. 2 Travers children, members of the parish, were washed out to sea from their grandparents' property on Wall Street.
One of the tragedies, of course, is that in terms of Stonington, we had some children in Stonington who were at their grandparents' house on Wall Street, and they were washed out to sea and lost. And they were both members of this parish, and their brothers only died recently, and never forgotten.
A fishing boat had washed ashore over the railroad tracks, bending them enough that the next train was derailed. Since the tracks were flooded, the danger could not be seen and averted. Several passengers were injured, and 2 lost their lives.
There was one woman lost on that train because they told them to all come up in the front of the train, and she was scared and noticed the door, and she decided she was going to get off the train, and it was right on the trestle, and she walked out. And a man jumped over to try and save her, and he was drowned, and that wave brought in so much, that tidal wave. It was so rough. They found his body up beyond Route 1.
Since the parish property is at the high point in the borough, it, along with the neighboring Stonington Free Library, became a shelter for the crash victims and those displaced from Cannon Square down to the point.
They told us not to go down the point. They thought, that's where I lived, they thought the houses had gone out to sea. So they told us to go up to the library or to St. Mary's Church.
In 1945, Father Thomas Lawler succeeded Father Mahoney. Knowing that the parish centennial celebration was approaching, he engaged the Frederick Kuffner Company of Hartford to renovate and redecorate the church. Exterior and interior painting was done. A complete new heating system as well as new pews were installed. The sanctuary was redecorated in a style reflecting the Gothic revival. It included a stained glass window in the apse above the altar, an outstanding bronze tabernacle, and a nearly life-size crucifixion scene with Mary, the parish patroness, and St. John, her appointed protector, standing beneath the cross. As the centennial approached, Father Lawler busied himself with many of the preparations. Alveda Lewis Garrity was responsible for the music. She led the choir through a large amount of music prepared especially for the several liturgical services which completed the celebration.
We rehearsed a great deal for it, and we did have beautiful music. And I mean, I even at that time heard many comments from the parishioners who said the music was beautiful. And one man wrote me a letter, and he said he didn't think that New York Cathedral had anything better than we had right here. It was so nice.
The highlight was on Sunday, June 3, 1951, the centennial of the construction of the church. Bishop Henry O'Brien of Hartford presided over a solemn Mass of Thanksgiving offered by Father Lawler, assisted by clergy from throughout the Diocese of Hartford and Diocese of Providence.
The fact that they did it in 1951 is interesting, because that would have been an anniversary of the church building and not of the parish. And what's interesting is the diocese really kind of corrected me that our anniversary is in the year 2000 and not in 2001.
After the Mass, 1,700 people were hosted at a reception on the Rectory Green. Alfred Fail prepared a massive cake in the shape of the church to feed all of them.
They had it on the lawn. They had the big cake that Freddie Fayol made, and that was something. And it brought in a lot of people from the outside. Some people had been away for years and came back just for that purpose.
Father Lawler died soon after offering Mass on the Feast of the Purification of the Blessed Virgin Mary, February 2, 1953. In April of that year, Father Thomas Londrigan succeeded him in Stonington. On August 6th of that year, St. Mary became part of the new Diocese of Norwich for the 4 counties in eastern Connecticut and Fisher's Island in the state of New York. Father Londrigan oversaw the first blessing of the fleet, welcoming Bishop Bernard J. Flanagan on July 1st, 1956.
There had been a group of fishermen who invited a Portuguese-speaking priest from Fall River to come and bless their boats. And they had a little celebration after he did that. And that had been going on for quite a while. And then the idea of having something more elaborate really came very much with Arthur Medeiros.
Stonington fishermen, inspired by experiences in various ports during military service, brought unique touches to the new public event. They purchased the life-size statue of St. Peter, first of the apostles and patron of fishermen, which has a home in St. Mary Church when not being used for the blessing. The memory of fishermen lost at sea casts a special effect on the whole observance. Their names are all read at the Mass of St. Peter, offered for their eternal repose and for the success and safety of the present fleet on Sunday morning.
At the end of Mass, we always played, had a hymn for St. Peter during the Mass, and also at the end of Mass, we always used to play Red Sails in the Sea in the sunset.
Later in the day, a parade led by the fishermen makes its winding way through the borough to the church. There, the bishop and other dignitaries review the parade and join it on the way to the dock, where prayers are said and a wreath is laid at the fishermen's memorial. The bishop then boards the flagship. Each specially decorated boat with its crew and their family members is blessed as it passes the flagship. All of them rendezvous at Stonington Breakwater for prayers and a casting off of a wreath for those lost at sea. 1956 also signaled the beginning of a period of declining health for Father Londrigan. Recurrent cancer required him to be away from the parish for long periods of time. During those times, priests from the Society of St. Edmund came from their seminary and retreat on Ender's Island to serve the parish generously and faithfully. Father Londrigan succumbed to his long battle at St. Mary Rectory on March 3, 1960.
The first child that we had was a stillbirth, and I remember going up to the St. Mary Cemetery, and Father Londrigan said the prayers, and I wanted to give Father Londrigan, I think it was $20 I wanted to give him that day. So he says to me, "Well, you were a very brave man. You take your wife out to dinner," and this is what I remember that Father Londrigan did to me, and I thought he was a wonderful man.
On April 27th, Father William Patrick Loftus came to St. Mary Parish from his previous duties on Fisher's Island. That began a 27-year, most fruitful pastorate for him and for the people he had come to serve.
Father Loftus knew everybody, whether you were Catholic or Protestant. He'd visit everybody in the hospital, whether you were Catholic or Protestant. And he was a very likable fellow.
When Father Loftus was, he ran everything. He did everything. He took very little help from anyone.
And he questioned
the,
any kind of help because he was not absolutely confident that somebody could do it.
It was obvious that the church building could no longer serve the growing needs of the parish. He established the new church and parish hall building fund appeal to raise the estimated $375,000 necessary to construct a new facility. The officers of the appeal were Harold Moore, Samuel Grimes, Paul Shepis, James Henry, Walter Reardon, and Paul Ferguson. They organized a group of nearly 200 to make house-to-house visits to seek pledges. 443 families pledged a total of $150,000. The original church came down toward the end of July 1962.
I was sad about that. I was sad to see the old church go. I loved that church. I loved the altar and the statues. And I was always interested in church. I loved church. And I used to sometimes go when I went to church just to sit there and look at those statues. And they were so beautiful. You know, their eyes were so perfect. It seemed like they were ready to talk to you.
It was a nice old church. Very warm and comfortable. And of course, like Alvita said, it was getting too small. I think it only held 400 or 500 people. I think this one holds 750.
The altars were large. You know, they took up the whole, and the thing that fascinated me as a youngster going to church with my mother were the two big angels. They were great angels on the end of each side of the church, of the altar there. And the altar was so large, and the Blessed Sacrament Tabernacle was exposed.
Masses were offered at the Knights of Columbus Hall on William Street, and later the more commodious Stonington Town Hall on Elm Street.
Our first time going to Mass was at the town hall.
They had a larger auditorium up there at the time, and that's where Mass was held.
It wasn't going to church. I mean, you would go and you would kneel if you wanted to get down on the bare floor, but you didn't have to. You could sit. But it wasn't like going to church. I mean, you don't have the statues. You don't have all the interior decorating and everything. It was blah.
Bishop Vincent J. Hines dedicated the new church on December 15, 1963. By then, $200,000 had been raised. Father Loftus reminded the parish that money was still owed, and any offering would be greatly appreciated. Within 1 year, all of that had been paid in full.
Toward the end of the fundraising, things were going a little bit slower, and I understand Father Loftus got up one Sunday and mentioned that they were having trouble making the bills and that sort of thing, and that by the end of the day he had the money.
What we were paying, as you do today, more interest on a loan than you do on the principal, and you see what's going. And so he said that he figured out that if people who had $1,000 that they could afford to loan to the church, they could pay off the debt, and then he'd be able to pay off every year. He'd pay off someone, so he'd clear it up. And it's the only church was ever built and paid for in 3 years.
In 1975, more recent immigrants from Portugal established Our Lady of Fatima Society, obtaining a most inspiring and authentic statue of Our Lady to be housed in the church when not in use for their annual feast. Father Loftus's dedication to the parish and its people continued until his retirement on March 12, 1987. His 27-year tenure earned him the reputation as the most beloved pastor in the Diocese of Norwich. His gentle concern had touched the lives of many in Stonington, Catholic and non-Catholic alike.
I mean, Father was just close to everybody. Didn't make any difference who or what you were. He accepted you.
Well loved by everyone, though.
Oh, yes.
Very, very, very
He
affable
was
guy.
very, very much so. And a very caring person.
It was tragic for a lot of people when he died.
Father Loftus was just a remarkable priest. I mean, when Father Loftus died, they had his wake in the afternoon and then a parish mass for him in the evening at St. Joseph's in Chester. He had retired to St. Joseph's in Chester and had been there for 6 years. So you kind of expect, well, you know, there are not going to be a lot of people. It was standing room only at every part of his funeral there. And I went to a restaurant nearby there to pick up some dinner between the two things that were going on. And there were some people from Stonington at the restaurant, and we got talking and all that. Next thing you know, people at the next table overheard us and said that they had come from Derby, I think it was, because that was Father Loftus's first parish 60 years before, and he had married them, and they still remembered him.
Father Edward J. Davis came to St. Mary from St. Michael in Pawcatuck in 1987. Being well aware of Father Loftus's long service and great respect, he sought a low-keyed approach to improvements, which he realized were in order.
Well, just the suggestion of change was very hard for a lot of people.
Oh, yeah. Well, after 27 years with the same pastor, you know, there were a lot of things that were routine that just went on and on and on. And to bring someone new and change those things.
Whoa.
The Hammond parlor organ was replaced with the most up-to-date Allen digital organ. He took care to establish a working pastoral advisory council to encourage the laity to become more involved in the actual direction of the parish and to take some of the decision-making burden off the pastor's shoulders. In the same spirit, he established the Finance and Property Committee, which went about creating a 5-year plan for deferred maintenance and bringing the property up to current building codes. In January of 1993, Father Davis submitted his resignation to Bishop Riley upon reaching the mandatory retirement age of 75. On March 27th, Father Philip J. Gagan arrived as pastor of St. Mary. The 5-year plan for property renewal was put into effect within a few months, funded by the Parish Property Renewal Campaign. to which parishioners donated nearly $300,000 in 3 years.
We had our parish property renewal campaign began in September of 1993 and continued until 1995. And people were extremely generous to that campaign.
In the 30 years since it was built, a lot of things broke.
And fire codes were ignored. And,
You know, access for the handicapped, there was none. Exit lights. If you ever lost power, there were no emergency lights in the church. They were in the hall because that was used at night. But, you know, we went to a Saturday evening mass after we moved to the area, and that's dark in the wintertime.
A completely new heating system was installed. The hall was painted, and new soundproof classroom dividers were put in. A new roof was installed. Exterior lighting of the steeple was restored, and it was painted with a leak-proofing material. A handicapped access lift was provided in the west stairway off the parking lot. And the sanctuary was rearranged and redecorated to keep the liturgical setting reverent and ceremonies inspiring, yet in touch with the church's practice.
The sanctuary and the altar and the backdrop and the crucifix and the two statues have all been relocated and redesigned to a design that's closer to the original architect's suggestion.
It was hard for a lot of people to see that change take place. I think a lot of them didn't understand why it had to take place, but it really needed to take place because we simply did not have a facility for celebrating the Mass and the sacraments and all that's necessary.
Road repaving, bank clearing, and a new fence were part of the program for St. Mary Cemetery. Today, St. Mary Church stands as a cornerstone of the community of Stonington. Through the care and progressive development of many dedicated pastors, the church has served an ever-changing regional parish, of which this town has always been the center.
We've kind of been blessed by a sociological phenomenon in the sense that there are some other churches that are as old as 1850. There are many churches that after 1870 were built as immigration from Europe really increased. But what happens with most of the pre-1850 churches or 1850 churches is they are in the city. They are in places where immigrants came, and those parts of the cities have now been completely changed, and the parishes oftentimes are gone, or if they're there, they're hanging on by a thread. Where this parish is really prospering and prospers more.
It was a happy time, and we were like one big happy family down there. We knew everybody, where everybody lived. We knew with the children that we had in school, we knew where they lived. We knew what happened in the families and the good times and the bad times and so we were there to help them, each other. We were there to help each other.
This is my church. And if the devil himself moves in, I'm not moving out because it's my church.
What began as a solemn meeting place for Mass in the mid-19th century has grown to become a contemporary Catholic church, ready to serve its parishioners into the 21st century. Surely the grace of God will always continue to touch St. Mary Church.